Um, the Mets lost somebody who is a very important part of franchise history. I'm talking about Davey Johnson. Davey Johnson was the manager of the New York Mets from 1984 to 1990. Of course, he was the skipper who led the charge when the Mets won their most recent World Series in 1986. And Davey Johnson, the most winningest manager in Mets history, he has a managerial record of 595 and 417. He holds the record for most wins by a manager in franchise history. Davey Johnson, significant in baseball as a manager. He was the first manager ever in the history of the sport to use sabermetrics. He was also the first manager to use data-driven strategies such as matchups based on batter history against a pitcher, favorable platoon matchups based on who's pitching that day. Uh, Davey Johnson, and I'll say this, it's no secret how wild that roster of 86 Mets were between Darryl Strawberry, Dwight Gooden, and Keith Hernandez, the drugs in the clubhouse, uh, the sex rock and roll atmosphere at the time, not just with the Mets, but throughout the 1980s in that period of time in pop culture. Um, you had a lot of characters, like I said, Keith, who at the time, Keith Hernandez, and I love Keith Hernandez, especially as a broadcaster, but at the time, Keith Hernandez with the infamous Pittsburgh trial, where he was accused of snorting cocaine during games. I'm not saying he was guilty, but during that time period, the substance abuse issues of Darryl Strawberry and Doc Gooden were well documented. You had a wild guy in Lenny Dykstra running around. Kevin Mitchell, who the GM at the time, Frank Cashin, the late Frank Cashin, shipped off after his rookie season in '86 to San Francisco, sorry, because he was deemed a bad influence on the club. There were a lot of unique and strong personalities in that Mets clubhouse in 1986. The only person that probably wasn't difficult to deal with were probably Mookie Wilson and Gary Carter. But Davey John, it takes a real special human being to corral all those wild personalities. Don't forget, he had to deal with malcontent George Foster, who, after he was released from the Mets in the mid 1986, accused the organization of racism, despite the fact that there were other successful players with everyday roles on the team who were African American. You had to deal with malcontent George Foster. You had to deal with the wild partying after games, guys not showing up, guys showing up late. And he was able to take all those guys and put them together and accomplish a championship. Being a major league manager is not easy. I sit here and critique Carlos Mendoza all the time, but I could never fathom actually having to do the day-to-day work of being a manager. Um, Knowing when to take a player out of the game, knowing when to feed guys' egos and go against them, and having to answer to the general manager and the owner and the fan base and making adjustments on the fly. I can't fathom it. And then having to manage the personalities. And a lot of the times, managers often get overlooked their role. Like, when the team doesn't do well, we point the finger at the manager. When the team does well, we applaud the players. But Davy Johnson was. It takes a special human being again to deal with all of those personalities and put them together to accomplish something great. And that 1986 Mets team that he managed, I think if that team had anybody else under the helmet skipper, I don't know if they even get to the World Series, let alone win it that year. Davey Johnson, aside from being a major league manager, played 13 years in the show. World Series champion twice with the Baltimore Orioles, 1966, 1970. Ironically, was on the losing side of the 69 World Series against the Miracle Mets, led by Tom Seaver and Ed Kranepool, amongst others. As a player, Davey Johnson also was an Atlanta Brave. He was a teammate of the late, great Henry Hank Aaron. But again, Davey Johnson, as good as he was as a player, 2 World Series rings as a key contributor on those Orioles teams, more known for his managerial prowess. Aside from managing the Mets from 1984 to a portion of 1990, Davey Johnson also managed the Cincinnati Reds from 1993 to 1995, the Orioles from 96 to 97, the Dodgers from 99 to 2000, and the Nationals from 2011 to 2013. Again, Davey Johnson, his longest tenure as a manager was with the Mets organization. And again, Davey Johnson passing away at the age of 82. And he'll always be remembered in Mets lore for being the leader of men in 1986 in a wild time in both baseball and society. So again, he had an illness. He was hospitalized down in Florida, and he did pass away last week, Friday, 1 week ago today. So just want to remember Davey Johnson, who again, manager of the World Series champion New York Mets in 1986. Thank you for everything, Davey. And you know, I think I speak for all Mets fans when I say we appreciate everything that you did for this organization in getting us a ring, and the way you manage those personalities and all those guys and those players. So